Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our dialogue special coming to you from the Boao Forum for Asia in Hainan. I'm Yang Rui. Having experienced a double-digit growth rate for over 1 decade, China is obviously going through a painful period of readjustment as its growth rate slows inevitably. Does the way its economy is handled here still appeal to developing countries? Will the rest of the world keep a close eye on India, however, as India promises to surpass the Chinese GDP growth rate for a second consecutive year? Which economy, India or China, represents the future of emerging markets and perhaps help fundamentally improve the existing world order? We're going to have very tough competitions and collaboration to ensure co-prosperity through exercise of good governance. To answer these questions and more, I'm happy to be joined by 5 distinguished guest speakers from around the world. Let's give them a warm applause.
Justin Yifu Lin, the former senior vice president of the World Bank, is now the honorary dean of the National School of Development at Peking University. He holds strong confidence in the Chinese economy, claiming China will continue to grow economically and be the main driver of global economic growth. Nicholas Lardy is the Anthony M. Solomon Senior Fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. Larry Summers, former US Treasury Secretary, said there's no question more important for the global economy than China, and no closer student of Chinese economic policy than Nick Lardy. Gabriela Ramos is the OECD Chief of Staff and Sherpa to the G20. She's responsible for the contributions of the organization to the global agenda, including the G20 and G7, and oversees the preparations of the yearly OECD Ministerial Council meeting. She's contributed to the launch of major OECD initiatives related to gender, skills and development. Bibek Debroy is an Indian economist. Since 2007, he's been professor at the Center for Policy Research in New Delhi. In January 2015, he was appointed as a permanent member of the National Institution for Transforming India (IYOG), which is a replacement for the Planning Commission, and acts as a think tank for the Indian government. Fred Hu is chairman and founder of Primavera Capital Group, a China-based global investment firm. He was the former chairman of the Greater China Division at Goldman Sachs and an economist at the IMF. Hu has advised the Chinese government on financial and pension reforms, SOE restructuring and macroeconomic policies.
To begin with, let's have an opening statement from each of the guest speakers here about a clear definition of a China model. The presentation is limited to 3 minutes. Please, we start with Justin.
When we try to talk about China model, it is because the economic performance in China since transition in 1979 has been outstanding. And I would like to say China is the best performing transition economy in the world. And China is one of the best performing developing countries in the world. And so when we try to define the China model, depends on how you define. If you see the China model is because China has a Communist Party, CCP, then it's not a model for every country. It may contribute to the success of China, but certainly you cannot ask the US to have a Chinese Communist Party, right? Or other developing country to have a Chinese Communist Party type of party. But I do think there are some basic principles of the success in China which may have general implication for other developing countries or transition economy. For that, I mean, to be successful, the economy needs to be competitive. And to be competitive, a country needs to develop its industries, its sectors, its structural transformation according to the country's competitive advantages. Only you follow the competitive advantages, then the economy can be competitive. That's on the one hand. And secondly, every developing country is in the transition process. You must have a lot of distortion. You must have a lot of obstacles in your economies. And under this kind of situation, to be pragmatic in the transition process would be desirable. Certainly, we want to be a well-developed, well-functioning market economy, but that is the end result. You should not mix inspiration with prescription. And in terms of how to manage the transition, the pragmatic approach that adopted in China would also be a useful lesson for other countries. So if you mean China models means those two principles, then I would say yes, China provides some useful lessons for other developing countries as well as transition economies in the world.
Nick?
Well, I'll be a bit of a skeptic. I agree with much of what Justin said, but I don't think there really is a China model. And I agree with competition, developing comparative advantage, but where China has been successful at doing that, I think it has relied primarily on the market. Justin says, you know, the market is the ultimate outcome, but I think China's relied on the market in areas where it's been very successful. Opening up to foreign direct investment, becoming deeply integrated into the global economy, having competitive firms, that's all the result of liberalizing, open up entry to new firms, private firms, foreign firms, and competing on a global stage at which China's been quite successful. On the other hand, where China has retained control and not introduced competition, I think it's been much less successful. There are a number of areas. But the center of gravity has been to rely on the market, and that, I believe, is primarily what has generated rapid economic growth. The one footnote I would say is I do think China is a model for the role of the government in developing infrastructure. Governments have a very strong role in developing infrastructure in many economies, and I think China is something close to the gold standard in that. But that's not an area where you can rely primarily on the market. So market-driven with strong government support for infrastructure, but I don't think that makes it a model.
I want to broaden this discussion because the question is how much China can be a role model for the other developing countries. And I have to say that it has been an impressive expansion and delivery and progress for the many Chinese in terms of improving their living standards. But I don't see that this experience can be repeated by other countries for three reasons. First, because it was an export-led growth that was being right in a very expansionary moment of the global economy, which is not the case now, and I agree with Justin. Probably the slowdown is also linked to the fact that the global economy, I'm not sure it will reach again the kind of expansion. We hope not, because then we will get another crash as we had with the financial crisis. Second, complete neglect of environmental constraints. Not integrating those in the equation is always an afterthought. And at the OECD, we're trying to define a development or a well-being process that incorporates the environmental constraints right at the inset, not at the to arrange for afterwards. And the third element is that it's based only in GDP and GDP per capita. And the definition of well-being is broader than that. It has to do with inclusiveness. It has to do to sharing the benefits of growth with everybody, which has not been the case in China. And that's one of the challenges going forward. And it has to do with many other dimensions, not only the question of material well-being. It has to do with health, it has to do with quality jobs, it has to do with environment. So I think that, yes, very good first step, but many things to address going forward.
Vivek?
Well, we are talking about two different issues here, and I'd like to keep them separate. The first one is the replicability of whatever China has done to other countries, and one must not push that argument too hard because each country has its own individual context, its society, its history, its legacy. So that point should not be pushed beyond a point. On the Chinese model, I think also one needs to be a little bit guarded because it depends on the timeline. Are we talking about 79? Are we talking about the second half of the 80s? Several points have already been made. I completely endorsed what was said about the global economy and the export-driven model. But I also want to point out that much of the Chinese liberalization was began with liberalization in selected enclaves as opposed to across the board. And I also want to point out a significant amount of state intervention and state control that existed in the labor market. It existed and still does in the financial sector. Now, all of this happened against the backdrop of two other things that I think are pretty important to understand what's happened in China. One is the agricultural reforms beginning with 1979, and the fact that there had already been significant improvements in health, education, those kinds of indicators. And finally, while I agree with what was said about infrastructure, that infrastructure kind of state-driven investments requires very, very high investment rates and therefore savings rates. And there is a significant component there of mandatory saving. And I also want to quickly flag the issue of the efficiency of those investments, because whatever incremental capital output ratio measure one has and whatever the indicator of investment, those investments have not necessarily been very efficient.
Fred?
Well, first of all, I don't believe in China model. So I cannot give a definition to something that doesn't exist. To be sure, China has been enormously successful. I'm both a participant and a witness of the remarkable economic transformation that has taken place in this country for the last 30 plus years. But, on most fronts where China has been successful, what China has done right, I don't think that's unique or exceptional to China. In fact, it just reflects the common pattern in the world for the last 200-300 years since first industrial revolution. It's really about free markets, competition, providing expanding economic freedom and the right economic incentives to the population, starting with the countryside to peasants, then to urban dwellers, unleash entrepreneurship. So that's really the secret ingredient of success in China. But these ingredients, unfortunately, do not exclusively belong to China. In England, Industrial Revolution, then in continental Europe, in North America, and of course in our neighbor, East Asia, starting with Japan, Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, Hong Kong. So more or less referring the same economic formula to success and prosperity. So therefore, the China model does not exist.
Thank you very much for the very interesting disputes and disagreement to a large degree, and thank you for the insights. To take a peek at the secrets and alternatives to the China model, let's look at this background report.
Trade and investment. China has built its 3 decades-long economic miracle on these 2 pillars. But now, with a flagging growth, will its Belt and Road Initiative and the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank consolidate the pillars while absorbing overcapacity? Feverish property market, large infrastructure constructions. The old path of stimulating the economy still remains active. China seems to be caught in the middle between reforming its economy and stimulating growth. Will boosting Chinese consumption be a formidable task? Internet startups, artificial intelligence, and cutting-edge innovations. China is exploring Industry 4.0, and that might give China a leading position in the next wave of human history. Is China really prepared for this opportunity?
中国市场还有很大的潜力，人民群众可以说有无穷的创造力。
China has a unique system combining its state-owned economies and the private sector. Is it replicable for the rest of the world? And how will China fulfill its commitment to giving the market a decisive role?
Now let's just start our panel discussion. You can challenge each other freely, and of course you can also challenge the host. There's something very controversial about the alleged China model. Look, we have very strong, powerful central government that's able to engineer the infrastructure-led growth. We also depend on investment as well as exports for much of the prosperity over the past 2 decades and so, where we enjoy double-digit growth. However, this is hardly to be copied elsewhere in the world. Does that make a point for you, or is there a point in what I say?
If you want other country to copy everything in China, then it's impossible. So if you define China model in that way, certainly it's not applicable, and since it's not applicable, you should not be considered as a model for other countries to imitate or to learn. But there are some basic principles which make China to be successful. For example, I agree with Lottie, Nick, that China is moving towards a market. But China maintains certain control in the old state-owned enterprise sectors. But I think it reflects what I say, pragmatism. Because we know other transition economy in Eastern Europe, in Russia, or in other developing countries in Africa and Latin America, their starting point was very similar to China. They had a lot of state intervention, and they also had many inefficient enterprises, sectors. But in the 1980s, during the neoliberalism Washington Consensus, the idea was to remove all the distortions simultaneously, allow the market to function. But as a result, we know all the countries followed that approach, collapsed, stagnant, and a crisis hit frequently. And so people describe that period of time as lost decades for transition economy for other developing world. And China was successful was because China was pragmatic. We have an oil sectors which was not efficient, which were very capital intensive, which went against China's competitive advantages. If you want to remove all the distortions without government intervention, they will collapse immediately. And so under this kind of thinking, a pragmatism would say, if we want to develop economy, we need to have stability. Certainly, we also want to have a dynamic economic growth. Another Chinese way of doing things was, well, for the oil sectors, we provided some transition protection and subsidies. We know they are inefficient, so we need to give them transition protection and subsidies to maintain stability. But for the new sectors, like light manufacturing, export-oriented sectors, we liberalized, not only liberalized, we facilitate the entry to those kind of sectors. We actively do investment promotion to invite FDI to go to those kind of sectors. I think if we understand China models in that way, certainly this model has implications for other transition and developing economies. We can look a few successful transition economies. Basically, they all did the same thing. Vietnam, Laos, and in Africa country, Mauritius started in 1970s. They did exactly the same thing.
Can we go to governments that have done the same? For example, the import substitution of Latin America, you mentioned that was a state-led development that crashed miserably. Because probably they did not get the signals right, because probably they did not the massive investment in infrastructure that you mentioned, probably because they did not invest in human capital. But I think that this question of government-led, private-led, requires a lot of rethinking and balancing. Maybe not for the new developing countries, but if you look at the history of all the countries that have gone developed, the US or the UK or France, they have always had a very strong central power at the beginning. They have chosen the sectors they want to develop and protect them from competition and from any kind of interference from abroad. But then they manage to transition from that model to something that would allow them to get the price signals to see where the investment should go. The investment that they have done were pretty blunt, pretty straightforward to go and really put the country in the best shape in terms of infrastructure and human capital. Now you really need to get the market signals to know where you are going to be allocating the resources. And that's why this allowing for a more private-led development, it's difficult.
Well, India does have a very strong advantages in the service industry as the entry point into the world economy. However, you obviously lack the quality of infrastructure, and the economic total was only put at 2.2 trillion so far, whilst China is put at 10.3 trillion, almost double the size of the Indian economy. When you accuse China of not having equal distribution, putting a lot of investment in the state sector, the public sector, have you, are you aware of the enormous advantages that the central government boasts of in allocating the resources and in boosting, showing up the Chinese prosperity over the past 3 decades? I'd like to give floor to Fred for your comments on a comparison between India and China.
Well, I first of all believe India has enormous potential. The huge labor force and the vast market, also institution strength like democracy, rule of law, English language. I think it's all great strengths of India. I think this country clearly has incredible potential. But I think I agree with Justin that your comparison of the last 2 years' performance, to try to validate that or disprove one model after another. But that's suffering from sample bias. Just 2 years, say nothing. I think India and China now are quite a different stage of economic development. China, I think, in some, certainly by per capita income level, is quite a bit ahead of India. So now we're a middle income country. So growth rate need to slow down. We're making a new transition to a new growth model. So I wouldn't read too much of the growth differential, last year and this year, or maybe in the next few years. But just going to you, as a host, you sort of alluded the China model maybe is equivalent to authoritarian, strong state.
That's what the Western media alludes all the time about the lack of soft power, and therefore China will have a hard landing amidst the backdrop of our current downward pressure.
Unfortunately, I think many people in China also subscribe to the view. They actually take pride in the superiority of this type of model. Like the strong government, we can overcome. Notable example of the China's response to the global financial crisis. Look at strong state, make decision, incredible stimulus, at 1 second, whereas Washington still arguing for the top program. So I would say in the early stage of China's economic takeoff, the government played a really instrumental role. Whether it's fiscal infrastructure, special economic zones, providing law and order, social stability,
This is, of course, a big picture, but Nick, do you think it is the good governance of the Chinese Communist Party or the brilliant entrepreneurship of thousands of Chinese business executives that have contributed more to the prosperity? Or do you think the sustainability is very much at stake because of the existence of such factors, the good governance of the central government or entrepreneurship, which is questioned at this moment?
Well, I think it's
because of the labor-intensive
it's a
manufacturing
combination
of the small
that has
and medium
resulted in the
sized.
terrific growth. But if I had to pick one factor, I would say the entrepreneurship has been the most important. Look at the huge growth of agriculture when all the restrictions were taken off in the late 70s and early 80s. There was a tremendous boom in agricultural output that was generated by getting rid of the kind of socialist structure that had previously held down agricultural development. Then you had the opening up to foreign investment in the 90s and the rise of the private sector. Most people don't recognize private firms in China now are producing most of the exports. The state used to produce most of the export products. Now they're down to about 10%. So I think it's entrepreneurship that we've seen first in agriculture, then in industry, and where we should be seeing it next is in the service sector. But in the service sector, the government still has a very heavy hand. I, quite frankly, would like to take exception to this idea that it's now inevitable that India is going to grow more rapidly than China. Maybe for a year or two, maybe a little longer, but I would go back to what Justin said. Part of China's slowdown is cyclical, and it's domestic, because China had been over-investing in the property market, and the rate of growth of property investment has been slowing down. That has an adverse effect on the industrial structure. But China has enormous growth potential if it implements the right kind of reform program. it's still at 25% of the U.S. level, so there's plenty of catch-up. So it is not at all clear to me that India will grow more rapidly. It certainly might if China doesn't carry out a reform program of the type they outlined. I think the Chinese leadership knows very well what needs to be done. We saw a very good blueprint at the third plenum 3 years ago. Needs to be implemented, and if it's implemented, I think China will have relatively strong growth, and I would not be at all surprised if over the next 5 to 10 years they grow faster than India.
Mr. Francis Fukuyama, author of The Last Man and the End of History, says there are good reasons for China to engineer the prosperity of its infrastructure-led growth. It worked very well in China because we have a central government, a very powerful government, as I said earlier at the beginning of our kind of discussion here. Whilst in other parts of the world, we have a conflict, corruption, and all sorts of, for example, ethnic disputes that threaten to disrupt the existing world order. And therefore, he argues that China's ambitions and vision for Belt and Road Initiative are likely to be compromised in other parts of the world, particularly those that are involved in the stretches of the Belt and Road areas. Vivek, do you agree?
I'm going to react to a question that I thought you'd asked earlier. I think this is really for someone from the OECD countries to answer, but I think the OECD countries and what are called the developed countries as a whole are still grappling with the issue of recognizing that the powers that be, economic powers that be, have changed and that the axis has changed. You began this discussion by, I think, almost suggesting India or China. I don't think it's India or China. It has to be both. Take something like the G20. I'm not very sure that it's politically very correct to say this, but what is the G20? The G20 seems to be an attempt to recognize what should have been recognized through other means, because the G20 has no proper formal backing. It's an ad hoc kind of solution to the question of actually reforming international institutions, reforming the governance in the international institutions, of which the IMF and the World Bank are too. It's because the United States is unwilling to let go of the World Bank, it is because Europe is unwilling to let go of IMF, that we have this half-baked, half-hearted solution of the G20. There is no getting away from the fact that sooner or later the international institutions will have to be reformed. If they are not reformed willingly, they will perforce be reformed unwillingly.
Last comment.
I would encourage you not to use OECD as synonym of advanced economies.
Okay, fair enough.
Because that's really ignoring the incredible progress that the organization that I work with has done in building bridges with all the emerging economies. Is not recognizing that Mexico became member 20 years ago and we are a developing country. Colombia is trying to join, Costa Rica is trying to join, Chile joined. So,
okay,
and we have, China joined the development center of the OECD, and we work with the G20 at length. So I have to say that this north, south, east, west is just completely blurred. The OECD was the first institution that 10 years ago put together the shifting wealth, recognizing this. The question of the political dominance in certain institutions is a real question. I give more credit to the G20. I think that this is a very, very well thought institution to really try to get everybody that counts to look for answers for the global economy.
Gabriela, you are certainly wise and correct in raising a very important issue about how to get rid of stereotypes in examining the objectivity or in examining a complete picture of the China model or indeed the existing world order. The same could be said about whether China's new reality should be examined through an ideological lens. In the next Q&A session, let me take questions from the audience here. Please, first of all, identify yourself and raise the question. Target the audience to one of them. Thank you very much. Any questions? Please.
The world has been talking about the Asian century for quite some time. As the so-called Asian century comes into play, what do we see really as the role of China and India, either together or separately or whatever with the global situation? I'd like to ask Madam from OECD and Mr. Vivek Debroy.
I think that it's unavoidable to think that any solution for the global economy needs to engage China and India, and that's why I'm saying that the G20 provided for that possibility. And that's why organizations like mine has recognized that we need to work with them to really understand what kind of proposals, what kind of policies, what kind of debates we can have without the stereotyping and without the kind of framing that we have always had in this situation. The question that Justin said, oh, that's a very OECD vision about the digital economy. I mean, imagine the potential of platforms like Uber. You're changing the way the economy functions, and it's not related to only advanced economies. You don't need to have the whole infrastructure of technological development to have this kind of issues that allows you to catch up, and the kind of impact that that might have in Africa. And China has a lot to catch up on that score, in terms of broadband, in terms of access to internet, in terms of mobile. And so I think it's just, let's look at this as the world that requires everybody together to look for the solutions.
That's a very good comment. Before we answer the question, I'd like to respond to your comments. I think we need to have a structure to technologies in the industry also. First, the technology which are for the application in the production was the difference. Then any new technology which can improve the efficiency at a low cost, every country should adopt that, like Uber and so on, like internet. But the other type of technology is the production of technology itself. And the production of the technology itself, two types. One, many rely on human capital, and the product cycle is very short. The other one, the innovation or invention of new technology rely heavily on capital input, and the duration of those kind of invention in general is very long. And then under this kind of situation, a developing country may have the opportunity to be in a frontier of short cycle and human capital based technology. But for the long cycle capital-based technology, a developing country is still not in a state to compete. And under this kind of situation, it's better still to rely on the catching up process by borrowing, by licensing, by importing technology, so that we a little bit know what we are talking about.
Well, firstly on G20, let me quickly say, I have 2 points to make about the G20. The reason I call the G20 is, what is the criteria for membership of the G20? It is not very obvious what the criteria for membership is. If it is going to be an effective organization, it needs to have a permanent secretariat, which it doesn't. And had we reformed the international institutions, we probably would not have needed a G20. That's why I called it an ad hoc thing. Quickly on the question of leading growth, a lot of this discussion has been based on India and China, but it's not India and China. Southeast Asia has been growing reasonably fast. South Asia as a whole has been growing reasonably fast. Sub-Saharan Africa has also been growing really fast. So let us not get fixated only on India and China. There are other parts of the world which may not be individually very important quantitatively, but there are other parts of the world which are also growing reasonably fast.
Yes, we have to look at the representation.
Let me try to reflect my ideas on this very important question between related to China and India. I think both China and India are great old civilizations. That's one thing. And secondly, now we all have potential to modernize ourselves and to become a big economy, influential economy in the world. But I strongly believe if we work together cooperatively, that will be beneficial to India, to China, and to the rest of the world. And if we do not work together cooperatively, it's not good to India, not too good to China, and not to the rest of the world. So with that regard, it's better we have the civilization, we have the wisdom, so we should work together.
Go ahead.
My question would ask the friends from India. India has a lot of very excellent top managers among the multinational the companies, but China seems to have some, but not so many. So is that the advantage of the Indians, the talents that can manage some kind of the multinational, the companies or global companies? How do you comment about that? Thank you.
Well, my comment on that would be linked to what was said earlier about services, that whenever we talk about services, we tend to pick on the highly visible ones, be it the financial sector or IT. But that's only a limited part of the services sector. Most of the service sector growth comes from elsewhere. Now, you focused on management in multinationals, but there again my comment would be that's the visible end. There is a strong layer of management personnel elsewhere also. That's probably largely a function of prior investments in the higher education sector. So all I'm saying is don't look at only the tip. There is a huge base from which that tip is moving up.
All right, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, we've been discussing the huge success of the Chinese economy, the adversity, the challenges, the myths, if not the bubbles, that we had over the past 3 decades after we went through a period of double-digit growth. We also discussed the competitive advantage of India, which is fast catching up. And we are discussing whether this will mean the service industry in China will sustain our growth and China will continue to play the role of powerhouse for the world economic recovery. I thank you very much for your participation and particularly the insightful views and analysis from the panel here. Thanks a lot. With that, we come to the end of this dialogue special coming to you from Boao Forum for Asia in Hainan. I'll see you next time. Until then, goodbye.
Sorry to give you a hard time.
Enjoy it.